This is the oldest cookbook I could find, written right here in our remote frontier town. This little house is even older than the cookbook, dating back to the 1890s, which in Montana is as old as houses get. And I think I've just found the cookbook owner's favorite recipe. It appears twice, handwritten, and we're going to bake it today in the oven of this old wood-burning cook stove. That's if we can make it through the sub-zero snowy morning and get the cabin warm enough. No small feat. I'm not sure of the exact date. The other recipes are from the late 1800s to early 1900s. This one is handwritten in the margins of this old cookbook, and it's written again on a later page. I can just imagine the stories this book could tell. Lots of years of being well loved. This recipe ends with the words, "used for 20 years." That means something to me. It was a big part of at least one family's life. Today, let's make this just as the author describes it. Molasses drop cakes, along with a steak and bacon pie. Perfect foods for a winter meal in a cold, isolated cabin.
Two eggs, 1 cup of lard, 1 cup molasses, 1 cup of brown sugar, a heaping teaspoonful of ginger, a teaspoon of soda, dissolved in 1 cup of boiling water, 5 cups of flour. Drop in greased tins and bake. I don't know which way to go. You kind of have to read these recipes almost like a little bit of archaeology. You have to dig through other history books and other knowledge in order to understand what on earth you're supposed to do with these recipes. These are some of those recipes, when you see them handwritten in the margins, you know they're good. Because you know somebody tested it, somebody tried it out, and they found it good enough to handwrite into the cookbook. That always recommends a recipe, right? And this one's even wilder because it appears not just one time, but it appears twice handwritten, and the person cut out a newspaper clipping that had the same recipe in it. So that's 3 times total that the woman who owned this cookbook took the time to add this recipe. Mrs. C. Haskins from Mrs. R. von Sobel. The recipes are all identical. They don't vary, and they give you almost no information on how to make the recipe. So she gives you the ingredients, which is wonderful, but she doesn't tell you to mix the dry ingredients and then the wet ingredients. She doesn't tell you if you should cream the lard into the mixture or if you should melt it. Both ways of making a cookie are in this cookbook. So it's a mystery.
Reading these recipes feels a little bit like talking to a grandmother. The recipe assumes you already know how to cook. They often don't include temperature or even the order of mixing things. The best ones say, add enough flour, or mix until right, bake until done. One of the fascinating things about this cookbook is that the recipes are contributed by local women. So you have Mrs. Smith, for instance, telling you how to bake a pie, or Mrs. Gardner telling you about her persimmon pudding. As neither of these require any mixing, the labor saved is considerable. So I'm gonna take that to mean that you don't have to cream the lard into this mixture, which is difficult. I remember being in college and my friend Karen and I decided we were gonna bake cookies, and we went over to her house and she didn't have a KitchenAid mixer. And I said, well, I guess we can't make the cookies because you have to have a mixer to do it, right? And she laughed in my face, which she should have, because all it really takes is time and muscle. But if you haven't grown up knowing how to do it that way, then you don't know. I can give younger me a little bit of grace because I'd never heard of doing it that way. I had just always used the one tool we had for cookies, right? But as far as this recipe goes, if it's a choice between creaming it or melting it, I think I'm gonna try the version where we melt the lard in. Often that can lead to a really soft cookie. I'm kind of thinking that's what we could get this recipe to do, to be a soft, chewy cookie as opposed to a snappy, crisp cookie. This recipe leaves me guessing.
I think number one, we're gonna cut this recipe in half because 5 cups of flour would make a lot of cookies. I think half that amount is just fine for us. We're gonna do the melting method for the fats. Seeing as this recipe calls for a full cup of boiling water, I'm gonna guess that that's the direction this recipe wants us to go.
I've been thinking in my head that these are a cookie, but that's not true. This recipe calls these molasses drop cakes. That's kind of a new one for me. So these are going to be a whole new category of dessert that I'm unfamiliar with.
In goes the molasses. We want about half a cup. In goes the egg. Brown sugar. A little bit of salt. And the very important ginger. Half a teaspoon.
If this is transporting you to another time, I hope you'll leave a comment or share a story down below. We've got a little community going of incredible memories from a way of life that has nearly completely disappeared. Some remember grandparents living this way, and a few of you out there still actively cook on these old stoves, or have lived a rugged off-grid life. These pioneer skills are rapidly disappearing. Once known by everyone, today it's only the few. There's a beauty to this work though, and who knows, we might have to go back to this knowledge one day.
In goes the flour. 2 cups, half a cup. The oven temperature is getting close.
This recipe calls for dissolving baking soda in boiling water.
It's just not something we really do anymore, but I'm guessing that old school baking soda, so chemical leavening, that was still relatively new for the common person to have access to. And something like molasses cookies back in Germany, it was top secret for a long time how to get cookies to rise and be soft and fluffy. And I think in the 1700s, it was kept guarded. Nobody knew how to make cookies like that. Only certain bakers could make a ginger cookie that was fluffy instead of snappy. So by the time these chemical leavenings come along, they're not always super reliable, and so doing something like dissolving them in boiling water made sure that they didn't have clumps, and it helped to activate them. Today we just go to the store and we know that baking soda is really fresh and is going to work, but obviously that was not the case for most bakers out here on the prairie. So the boiling water trick, I'm guessing, is to solve the leavening problem so that the cookies would be light and fluffy.
All right, they're out of the oven and they're piping hot. After a quick cool, these are going to be our treat before we get on to dinner.
These are delicious. They're kind of a cross between a cake and a cookie. She refers to them in her recipe as drop cakes, which isn't really something I'm all that familiar with, but the texture of these is great. It's really light and fluffy. It's got the good molasses and ginger flavor, but it's not super strong. It's fairly mild. All right, more work to do.
A steak and bacon pie is up next for dinner with the family. The trick I can confidently say with making pie crust, learned from years of doing it, is to keep the ingredients ice cold and to work the dough as little as possible. Gluten formation will ruin the crust by making it tough. The recipe doesn't tell you that, you just have to know. So work fast with cold hands. People who know cook with lard. It fell out of fashion hard these last decades, but it is the magic ingredient to fantastic biscuits and pie crusts. And it's all natural. sourced from the pig that many a homesteader would have raised. Any old cookbook worth its salt should have this recipe, and this one does.
1/3 shortening and 2/3 flour. Always use lard. Cut lard into flour with 2 silver knives. Rub with hands until fine and even. Mix with ice water to proper consistency. Roll out and spread with lard and small bits of butter. Fold over 1/3 each way, roll out and proceed as before 3 times. Put in the icebox and chill thoroughly before baking. Have a hot oven. Recipe by Maud Hilger. Hilger's a famous name around here. There's actually an entire town called the town of Hilger.
Should have bought my rolling pin.
You wanna come try it? Come over here.
Yep.
Come on. That's the way.
Dessert is nice, certainly a treat, but I can't feed my family that. We need a hearty meal. The steak and potatoes of life out here were literally steak and potatoes, and I want to wrap it all up into a pie, with a twist. Leftover smoked steak scraps with fried up bacon to make the filling stretch. A few potatoes diced in to help it thicken. A bit of reduced beef stock for saltiness, and what vegetables the root cellar could provide go in next. This time of year, the fresh vegetables were likely holding on, so long as the summer's garden produced anything at all. This is a very harsh place, prone to weather disasters and wildlife, even today. And certainly back when ranchmen first attempted to live up here in the frozen north, it was the same, and maybe a bit worse. First-hand accounts like this one from the famous Theodoe Roosevelt tell us what it was really like to get by out here alone, far from any help, and what foods you could find to eat. For many people, it wasn't much.
A rancher's life is certainly a very pleasant one. His fare is simple, but if he chooses, it's good enough. Many ranches are provided with nothing at all but salt pork, canned goods, and bread. Indeed, it is a curious fact that in traveling through the cow country, it is often impossible to get any milk or butter. But this is only because the owners or managers are too lazy to take enough trouble to ensure their own comfort. We ourselves always keep 2 or 3 cows, choosing such as are naturally tame, and so we invariably have plenty of milk and a good deal of butter. From our garden, we get potatoes and other vegetables as well, unless drought, frost, or grasshoppers interfere, which they do about every second year.
Roosevelt lived on his ranch until the brutal winter of 1886 to 87, when he lost all of his cattle to the deep snow and cold. He returned back east and went on to make history as our 26th president. With the pie dough made, all those garden holdovers we chopped earlier can go in. If you want to get really fancy, of course, you can saute them separately and go to a great deal more trouble and mess. But I have to do the dishes, so we're keeping this fare very simple. 1 pie plate and a cutting board to wipe down. A dusting of flour thickens the pie. Now you may be thinking the cabin is toasty warm by now, after cooking all day. That's not the case. Heating homes is very zonal. So, sitting by the cook stove or the fire, you might be nice and toasty, but as you get further away from that, the temperature drops. There's a lot of homesteader stories I've read where they would wake up to a frozen dish of water in the morning, and they'd have to crack through it to wash their face. Or their bedrooms, often just separated by a sheet, were so cold that they would climb under their blankets that were stiff from the frozen air. Life was different. It certainly reminds me how strong we are as a people. We don't need all this climate-controlled comfort. It's nice, but we don't need it. It feels good to be reminded we can do without, and we'll still survive.
Goodness. Look at those
And out it comes. This steak and bacon pie is rustic fare, but warm and filling. The broth inside is salty and good, enough meat to make a meal, with carrots, onion, and potato adding that elevation that a rounded meal needs.
Pretty yummy, isn't it, George?
If Robbie eats it, well, that's satisfaction enough for me. The sun is starting to sink on the horizon. Candles are going. But without running water, cleanup becomes a different breed of work out here. A steaming pot of water on the cook stove is all we have. 2 pots would be nice, but 1 will do tonight.
Hey Maggie, have we ever called you Travis?
Yeah, George has.
Very funny.
And just like that, it's time to close the book on a day of time traveling.
I just want to say a special thank you to all you guys who've stuck through these videos, especially those who leave comments and share stories of their own. It really makes the whole journey fun. We'll see you guys in the next one.